Well, good morning to everybody in the United States. Good afternoon to those joining us from Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and welcome to everyone. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to this event, which is our last public webinar of 2020, a year in which we have moved almost all of our content and events online. As for so many other people, it's been a big adjustment, but I've been very happy with the quantity and the quality of our digital presence, and especially of our events like this one. This event today is part of our long-standing collaboration with the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD. And this will be a presentation from one of our AICGS research fellows, Dr. Jonas Driedger. And we're also very pleased that we've had such a good group of virtual fellows, virtual for the first time in our history, and they've done really excellent work. So I look forward to hearing today's presentation. I'm glad that you have all joined us. And now I will turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Gail Maddox, who is the director of our Foreign and Security Policy Program, who will take us through. So thanks for being with us. And Gail, you are at the helm.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. And good morning to all of those who braved our snowstorm to join us here, and those who are in other climates as well. Our speaker today, as Jeff mentioned, is Jonas Driedger. He's the DAAD AICGS Research Fellow this fall, and he's currently also a research associate and PhD candidate at the Social and Political Science Department of the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. So he comes to us out of different climate. Jonas has an interesting background. He has been a visiting scholar and Alpha Fellow at the International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism Higher School of Economics in Moscow, Russia, from 2018 to 19. He also has an MA from Warsaw, Poland, and at the College of Europe. His project, and he has a number of different publications that are either pending or have been published, as well as chapters. His project today, and what he's going to speak on, is Trump, Merkel, and Putin, Lessons and Legacies for Transatlantic Cooperation toward Russia. And that has been an assessment on how the Trump presidency has affected US-German security cooperation with Russia. And I think that in the midst of our transition now to the Biden administration, it's a particularly good and interesting project to do virtually anyway, with Washington, D.C. In his paper, he points to issues that have shaped the three-way relationship, from diplomacy to NATO troops and nukes, to the impact of energy issues and Russian hybrid warfare, and to the interference of Moscow in the US 2016 elections, to name just a few of the tensions that he addresses in his writing. He then offers 4 precautionary lessons for US policymakers, and I look forward particularly to hearing what his findings are. So let me turn to his findings while a virtual fellow here at AICGS over this past fall. Jonas, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Gail. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you to everybody who is here and all the people at AICGS that made this happen. It is amazing to be able to speak to so many people on research, whilst I think the only living being in the same house right now is a cat that, aside from me, of course. So there's one cat eyeing me and she seems a stern critic. So let's see if I can maybe please the rest of the audience. So let's get right into it, and let's set the stage. I hope the presentation is visible, and I will proceed with that assumption. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Gail. So whilst thinking about the basic structure of my research, I felt a bit Catholic about things, which is a bit strange because I have a Mennonite background. I'm not a Catholic myself. Nonetheless, I noticed that in the setup, everything was about trinities. And that starts with the research questions that I address. And there are 3 of these research questions. First of all, I want to look at how the German-American cooperation toward Russia developed under Trump. Then I want to probe a little bit into the question of whether these changes occurred because of Trump's particular worldview and personality, or whether other factors were at play. And then third, as Gail mentioned, I want to look at lessons for future policy toward Germany and Russia. And I'm addressing here mainly an American audience. So this brings us to the usual question on why is this relevant, in case anybody needs a reminder. So transatlantic relations, arguably historically, have largely developed in an interaction with Russia or what was then the Soviet Union. And Russia nowadays represents arguably the greatest military challenge that at least Europe faces, and by implication is also very important for the US. So this is a core aspect of transatlantic relations. Then one might say, why focus particularly on Germany and Russia? And as I will show while the presentation goes beyond, Germany and the United States have cooperated particularly extensively ever since Russia started to use its hybrid and more overt measures against Ukraine in 2014. And that is analytically and politically quite relevant. So a focus on Germany and the United States is important because that relationship has a lot of ripple effects on overall transatlantic relationships in general. And then lastly, there is a wider question that also goes into a theoretical territory where we ask how much do the leaders on top of state bureaucracies, what kind of difference do leaders actually make? And if they make a difference, what exactly do these differences consist in? And then lastly, to just indulge you a little bit into how I personally got to this work, basically, this research question emerges out of previous work. I have very, very recently defended my dissertation where I focus on military conflict between great powers and small neighbors. And the Russia-Ukraine relationship is a very important case study there. And I'm also looking into the causes of peace and conflict between Russia and other small neighbors, develop an overall theory, and try to draw a larger conclusion. And that then leads to a second pair of research questions, namely, if you are one of these small neighbors of a great power, how do you deter potentially hostile actions by your overbearing neighbor? And that leads us into questions of alliance management, security cooperation, and deterrence. There I have just published an article for European Journal of International Security where I look at how Germany and the United Kingdom cooperated towards Russia throughout the Brexit process. And now you can see that the question of how Germany and the United States cooperated throughout the Trump process, if you will, is a similar related but different question that is very relevant for this overall cluster of questions. And then lastly, on a substantive level, how can we learn more about European and transatlantic defense cooperation towards the main challenge in Europe, Russia? And that leads us straight into the heart of the matter. The first empirical category that I open up is the question of diplomacy. And here, sticking with the Trinity theme, I want to give you 3 images that I, like a journalistic hack, am using to tell a certain narrative. And here they are. So on the top, you can see Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin eyeing each other very suspiciously. Then you have what fairly straightforwardly represents a certain disconnect between the President of the United States and the Chancellor of Germany. And then a somewhat suspicious, somewhat cordial, however you want to interpret it, handshake between 2 men that were back then arguably among the most powerful people on Earth. Now, how can we look into the area of diplomacy when it comes to American-German security cooperation towards Russia under Trump? I would argue there are 4 broad categories that need mentioning. So it's no secret, and I don't think I need to elaborate too much, that the overall rhetoric of Donald Trump towards Germany and the EU was a negative one, particularly towards Merkel, criticisms of specific policies, but also on character and overall personality. In 2017, Donald Trump was asked about his relation towards Putin and Merkel, and he gave a response that, that did not just imply, he said, "I'm not sure if I can trust either of them." So that bears repetition. The President of the United States at that point was equivocating the leader of one of the US's main allies with the leader of a state that has just been declared as a major rival of the United States. Trump's rhetoric on Merkel very often relates to that about the EU. Sometimes you get the feeling that Trump didn't make much of a distinction between the EU and Germany, and he labeled the EU as a direct foe in economic competition. A rhetoric that, to my knowledge, is unprecedented in transatlantic relations. You can also tell that things really changed in terms of diplomatic appointments. When Trump entered office, he fired pretty much straight away the US ambassadors to both Germany and the European Union, and left these posts vacant for a year, or for over a year rather, and then brought in for the EU Mr. Sondland, and for Germany Mr. Grenell, I think is the pronunciation. Both of which, from the diplomatic course in their respective cities, quickly got a reputation of being brash and disparaging, and sometimes in their public pronouncements not very helpful in terms of their rhetoric about Germany and the EU. People also quickly noted that what these 2 characters brought was that they had a strong personal connection to Donald Trump, and not so much towards the administrations that they were seconded to. Then thirdly, and again, this is widespread knowledge, Trump has been largely silent on Vladimir Putin itself and on Russian conduct in the world, and has at times quite overtly tried to not cast a negative light on either of them, and has expressed his appreciation of Vladimir Putin several times. And this, arguably the most stunning example of this, was when pressed about this, Trump stated that he believed the Russian president's word, that there hadn't been Russian election interference over that of US intelligence services, as well as the allied intelligence services, which again brought several people in Germany and in the European Union, got them to question whether transatlantic unity on such an important topic as electoral integrity was still at play. And it did not escape anybody that this was a politicized issue within the US, where the Trump campaign was accused of colluding straight out with Russia, and that this had apparently effects on US domestic politics. All of this had impact on multilateral forums. Russia had been expelled from the G8 after the events of 2014. Merkel was quickly pressured by the German business elite to readmit Russia, but resisted these pressures. Trump in 2018 wanted to include Russia into the then G7 forum, in which he didn't succeed. During the same summit, negotiators were on the European and German side were irritated because American negotiators had their quarrels with including the phrase to support the liberal international and rules-based order into a final communique. Again, in my reading, an unprecedented event. This leads us to the next aspect, NATO troops and nukes. And here, of course, the president's repeated rhetoric on casting doubt on US commitments, his again and again, him trying to connect the issue of US protection over European countries on what he was apparently thinking of as fees to NATO, which relates to the defense spending issue under NATO, is widely known. Internal sources converge to the point that this is an actual belief that Donald Trump holds, and that he repeatedly wanted to push to get the US out of NATO, sometimes as a matter of principle, and sometimes if, you know, in his estimation, the European allies wouldn't cough up what was due in terms of payment. There's a strong whiff of transactionalism in the NATO policy of the Trump administration. So on the one hand, you had these calls for higher defense spending within NATO, and then when the EU initiated the European Defense Fund in order to raise defense spending and make it more efficient, US US negotiators and higher rank officials quickly cautioned against what they called protectionism. And very quickly it became clear that this was about US weapons manufacturers getting their fair deal in this EU defense fund, which made people in Berlin and Brussels wonder if this whole tension about defense spending was about effective deterrence against Russia to begin with. In summer 2020, Trump announces very unexpectedly towards the allies and also to high-rank military personnel in Europe that a huge troop contingent will be withdrawn from Germany. And this is preceded by rhetoric that we already know, namely that Germany is Russia's captive, doesn't pay its fair dues, does a lot of energy business with the United States, and so forth and so forth. Lastly, we have the Trump administration withdrawing from the INF Treaty. Under the Obama administration already, there has been criticism of Russian conduct under the INF Treaty. However, Obama back then, even though pressured by certain parts of the US security elite, held off of withdrawing from the INF, in part because the calculus was Germany prefers the INF Treaty to remain in place in order to have a measure of arms control within Europe. The Trump administration then decided to withdraw, and both the German defense minister and the chancellor said that this was an ill-coordinated move with Germany, and that there was no alternative plan to guarantee arms control and strategic stability in Europe. Next aspect is sanctions, and here, of course, the German-Russian gas trade is important. Now, just as a reminder, in 2014, both Germany and the United States were at the forefront when it came to organizing a unitary front towards Russia in response to its aggression against Ukraine, to organize sanctions that were consistent across the Atlantic, and also respected certain interests of the transatlantic allies, not just including German gas interests, but also, for example, the city of London in the United Kingdom. Then we get, with the Trump administration, a curious pattern where sanctions of the US against Russia intensify under the CAATSA legislation, for example, but also in response to the poisoning of Skripal in the UK and Russian oppositionist Navalny in Berlin. where you have increasing sanctions. However, you see an American president that very often when these sanctions come is publicly opposed to them or signs them into being without further addressing them. And in case of CAATSA, it was quite clear that if Trump would have opposed it, he might have well been overridden by Congress. So this sends various messages to the allies, and the question is where does the bulk of US national interest actually lie, and how consistent will it be in the near future? Then there is a strong connection between CAATSA and EU energy business. So CAATSA was mainly or almost exclusively the brainchild of Congress, where in a rare showing of bipartisan and almost unanimous resolve, Congress puts in place a sanction package that is quite significant, but ties the White House's hands, but also can easily be used against EU energy businesses that conduct business with Russia and the Nord Stream 2 consortium. The interests of American energy businesses were heeded in the final version of the bill. In my reading, the same cannot be said for European businesses, and both the EU Commission and Berlin addressed this and were quite outspoken in their criticism of that, with a rhetoric that again seems unprecedented. Then lastly, I just want to shortly mention that the US withdrawal from the JCPOA against Iran also had repercussions on German business interests, because now German firms that were able to conduct business with Iran under the existing sanction regime might now well be targeted by the US. And in response, both the German and French leaders went to Russia in order to maybe retain what was left of the JCPOA. So a rare showing of unity, not exactly in the mind of transatlantic cooperation towards Russia. Short comments on the Ukraine policy proper. In terms of military aid, that is military hardware like anti-tank missiles, under Obama, various people in the US security establishment pushed for lethal aid towards Ukraine, but Obama withheld that because the Europeans argued that this would not be good for the diplomatic process and might destabilize the situation. Under Trump, this then changes, but reportedly, this only changes after high-scale security advisors are telling Trump that this would be a good move for US business. So again, you have the White House acting largely on economic interests and rather than an overall value component that also takes into account the allies. And then, of course, we have the case of Hunter Biden, the famous leaked conversation between the president of the United States and the president of Ukraine, where there is at least an implicit quid pro quo to offer a benign intervention into US electoral process for the Trump campaign and against the prospective Biden campaign in return for the release of further US military hardware. In the same phone call, President Trump claimed that Germany and the EU was not really supporting Ukraine, which is not exactly true by almost all indicators. And it's also revealing because this is supposedly a private conversation where the President of the United States, without an apparent gain to it, badmouths allies and their actions. So this brings us to the question of legacies. What remains? What is our overall evaluation here? I think I have given you some anecdotal evidence for various categories, and overall one can definitely say that across these categories, transatlantic cooperation towards Russia has deteriorated under the Trump presidency, and this applies on the levels of public diplomacy and rhetoric, in multilateral negotiations, in NATO, force deployment, nuclear weapons policy, sanction regimes, and the Ukraine policy proper. Overall, one can say that under Trump, US policy towards Germany and Russia became a more unilateral one, a more erratic one, at times inconsistent one, unpredictable policy, which had real repercussions in how the US was considered by its European allies, both in the population as well as among its elite. Very often this affected areas that were somewhat contentious to begin with. So in terms of INF policy and nuclear weapons stationing, defense spending, the exact approach to supporting Ukraine, and of course, Nord Stream 2. Nonetheless, these conflicts were strongly exacerbated, some might argue needlessly so, and they did measurably, and you can see this in various polls and in elite interviews, there is a European antipathy towards Trump, especially in Germany, and this dislike does not just relate to Trump, but also to US policy and the United States more broadly. Now we can ask, is this a trend that will go on or will it be broken? And there I would say we will see a sort of a diminishment of it with the incoming Biden presidency. There will be the expectation of more predictability, of smoother cooperation and so forth. However, I would also argue that there are strong signs that some of these irritations are here to stay. Russia has become a more contended issue in US domestic policies, which you can see when you poll Republican lawmakers and Republican voters as opposed to Democratic lawmakers and Democratic voters, because of course now it's tied to the personality of Trump, who still holds sway in the Republican Party, and to the state of overall US politics. One example of that is that fairly recently, 126 representatives from the Republican Party petitioned the Supreme Court to disallow 4 states where the majority voted for Biden to have their electoral college votes cast in favor of Biden. So quite a strong embracing of Trump's rhetoric on the election being fraudulent, which of course, by all overt evidence, doesn't relate to reality. And nonetheless, you have a strong political signal in its support, even though the president is on his way out. You could also argue, well, it will not be so bad in Germany, because after all, after a wave of antipathy under George W. Bush and the whole fallout around the Iraq war, thence came Obama, and public opinion of the US soared again. This, of course, holds some sway, and I expect parts of this effect to become operative. Nonetheless, there is politicization further and further of the view of the US and relations to the US. So in several polls, for example, after the withdrawal from the INF Treaty, only about 20% of Germans said they wanted to continue to enjoy US nuclear protection. About 40% said they wanted rather nuclear protection by France or the United Kingdom. And a significant amount, I think about 30%, said Germany should not have a nuclear deterrent or one of its allies to provide that to begin with. And then we have all of these structural factors that continue to cause a transatlantic drift, which is the global power change that more and more pronounces Southeast Asia, that makes both Russia and Europe strategically less important, which focuses US attention more and more towards Southeast Asia. So that is just part of what I would say as a cautionary tale, to be too optimistic when the new Biden administration takes hold. So I will just mention the 4 points because I see that time becomes a factor. I have identified 4 issues that at least we should take away from all of this. And some of them might look very trivial here. The first one, even if you are a hard-nosed realist that doesn't take too much emphasis on the issue of values in international politics, attempts to coerce big allies rarely pay off. Germany between 2018 and 2019 actually lowered its expected defense spending. So amidst this pressure campaign by the Trump administration, the Germans decided to actually spend less on defense. So that has barely worked out. US attempts to convince Germany to buy more liquefied natural gas also from US sources. I don't see major advances there. A small LNG terminal has been built, which by most economic experts is considered as a symbolic gesture that is economically redundant, but what was made as a nod towards the United States. So German energy policy has not significantly changed, and work on Nord Stream 2 has been resumed. So these attempts by the Trump administration, I would argue, simply failed. If you design your own policy, try to take into account how it will affect your allies. I think the withdrawal of the INF Treaty is a very good example for this. Even if the US would have withdrawn, there would have been many ways of offering reassurance to the Europeans and consulting them in the process. There was needless fallout there, arguably, that you can see in the poll results that I just mentioned. Lastly, don't underestimate that the actions of the US actually cause long-term consequences among allies. And you can see that Americans are apparently unaware of how exactly the actions of the Trump administration affected transatlantic cooperation. In a 2019 poll, only 34% of German respondents said that relations between the US and Germany are good. And in the US, it was 75% of respondents that said that these relations are good. So something is going wrong here in terms of communicating about the quality of these relations. And then lastly, overall, if you compare the results of the Obama administration with that of the Trump administration towards Russia, you can see that a lot has been taken into place under Obama and Merkel, and a lot has been complicated and barely survived under the Trump administration. So that tells you something about the overall strategy that is most appropriate towards Europe and Russia. And with that, and being over time, and with big apologies to Gail, I hand it over. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That was a really good overview of the policies. I think that everyone appreciated the commentary that you had on each of the issues, because it's a big issue. And now in town right now, so thank you. Now in town, of course, all the discussion is of the transition team and the different groupings. Not too much has leaked out, but there's all kinds of suppositions about what will be happening and all. So based on what you have laid out for us, which was really impressive, how, if you were speaking to Biden and his transition people on Putin, on Moscow's reactions, and what they might do first after January 20th, how they actually best could address some of these issues that you put out there. Which issues, maybe 2 or 3, would you see as most important immediately to address? And let me just say here that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A for us to then ask Jonas to address. Jonas.
Uh-huh. So I would probably have in such a briefing included at least 3 aspects, one of which would be nuclear policy. I have been in Moscow when the INF Treaty was faltering and ultimately the US withdrew. And that had a real impact on the Russian security community. And one must understand that with all of the conversations about Russian predatory behavior and the politics of regime survival, there is in the Russian security community a widespread sentiment that the US is at least potentially very dangerous towards Russia. And there is a lot of thinking that the nuclear deterrent provides Russia with a modicum of security. So any changes in arms control regimes are seen with concern, not just within the small circles in the Kremlin, but also in the wider security community. If you pair that with the obvious European preference for a good arms control regime within Europe, and with the benign state of Germany not having nuclear weapons and enjoying the shared nuclear deterrent with the US, then I would say looking to prolong New START or finding some realistic replacement short-term solution that then bleeds into a new framework would be both politically possible and very much desirable. And it would very quickly signal both to Moscow and to Berlin and Brussels that progress can actually be made. So that would be a very pressing issue, I would say. On sanction policy, if you like it or not, there is still widespread support within Germany for the Nord Stream 2 project. It tends, in popular discourse, it tends to be associated with the Social Democrats and with the very controversial figure of Gerhard Schröder, of course. But one should not forget that this has been a bipartisan project by both the CDU and the SPD for now about 20 years. And no administration has really tried to even complicate that process. So there is a certain elite consensus about this in Germany. Looking at this and seeing that it also has become a politicized issue within the US, and that Congress during the Trump administration sanctioned businesses or threatened to that were associated with Nord Stream 2, this can be a major source of transatlantic tension because it also bleeds then into inner European politics where countries that would favor no Nord Stream 2 are seeing this as a sign that you can bilaterally negotiate with the United States in order to gain an advantage in this inner European controversy. And that complicates things immensely. So that is something that, depending on how much political room you have to navigate, would be something where de-tensing the situation and maybe focusing on other areas might well be a good idea. Because otherwise you will get conflict, no matter on your view on the ethics about it. It will complicate all other sorts of transatlantic cooperation. And then lastly, my reading from Russia is that actually the new Biden administration is perceived as a return to normality, where at least you have a certain predictability of US policy, similarly to the perception within Europe. And that can be something where you can identify certain areas on which you can make progress. I'm not an expert there, but apparently climate policy would well be one of these areas. And we must not forget, especially in US-Russian relations, if you can make progress in one area, it can have benign spillover effects into others, just as the other way around, where tension in one area usually leads to tension in others as well. So to take advantage of that initial, I don't want to say goodwill, but favorable expectations is definitely something I would do. And lastly, and I'm sorry to everybody for whom this is a truism, but in international politics, it pays not to take sides in the domestic politics of an allied country, which is a big takeaway, I think, for any new administration. I think there is a certain potential in Germany for anti-Americanism to become political capital for mainstream parties. It's not going to happen in 5 years. I'm not going to bet my money on that. But how I read the structural factors, this could be something that happens, and there it's better to avoid it from becoming big political capital to begin with. So there is the chance of quote unquote redemption here.
Thank you. I think climate also may be a very good potential theme to for both sides, the incoming as well as the Europeans. Let me go to Michael Kurtzig. He asks, what can you tell us about the initial meeting between Trump and Putin? Will we ever know what was discussed?
We will we ever know? I mean, we might, but there is no deeper insider knowledge that I can give you about it. Yeah, I think I should just leave it at that. I don't have insider knowledge, and then if you think about it, if I had it, I probably wouldn't utter it right here.
I think that's a good response. I don't think anyone knows. But if someone who just got their PhD doesn't know on this general topic, then I suppose it's not out there.
I would like to add, though, the question is, how much does it actually matter? Because if you look at the broader patterns of interactions between Russia and the United States and the transatlantic allies of the United States, there is so much that we can actually identify in terms of, for example, the people that find appeal in Trump's policies, or what the Trump presidency did with the Republican view on Russia and NATO. These are aspects that are graspable via reliable data and that tell us cautionary tales that I think will keep us busy politically. I'm not saying this is not something worth investigating. It should be if there was the source for it. But we have enough reliable data to talk about and to make steps forward in transatlantic cooperation.
Our next question is, how much continuity on Russia policy do you expect post-Merkel, given here the key role on Russia?
Yes, that is, of course, a fantastic question and a pertinent one, because we will have federal elections in 2021. And most observers, and it's also my impression, predict that Angela Merkel will not seek to again extend her tenure. What we might see is that she takes on another year, because it's easier to get high results if you run with the incumbent. And it's a certain tradition in German politics to have the incumbent win the election and then hand over office to the designated successor. Nonetheless, Merkel is likely going to go. And of course, Merkel herself and the group around her was instrumental in what we now see as the overall Russia policy. You could argue that, depending on how things go, that the extreme fringes of the German political spectrum, mainly identified by AfD and Die Linke, will gain strength. However, the German political system usually requires you to have at least one of the center parties in coalition, and these center parties have a lot of political experience, a lot of political clout, and are usually also the stronger one in the coalition. And that gives a lot of continuity to German policy. Very often, especially in Washington, people like to favorably compare policy under Merkel with policy under the Social Democrats. And my overall argument is actually that there is more policy continuity in these various administrations than there is what sets them apart. So from that on, I would say the internal forces of German politics push towards continuity, for better and worse from an American perspective. So you will probably not see an incredible rise in defense spending under whatever administration comes next, simply because the German domestic conversation and values go like this. But you will probably also not see a Germany that decides to put anti-Americanism as a huge rallying cry in order to gain other advantages. Mm-hmm. So I would expect much more continuity than separateness. And the global balance of power will projectedly go into the same directions. So these factors will also continue to exert a force of continuity on German policy.
Interesting, yeah. I think I agree with you. Let me give one that is. Let me pass on a question to you that is a good follow-on. You point out many of the issues that disappointed the Germans. What level of agency does Germany have to proactively improve relations, as opposed to hoping for a return to something closer to status quo?
So the question is, what policy measures does Germany have available in order to improve transatlantic relations?
And
yes.
I would imagine also, what direction would Germany like to take those transatlantic relations?
Right. Now, one matter of I like to frame these things more in terms of what do I find would be both desirable and manageable for the average German administration. So you can now have a certain wish list of, especially from a US perspective. I think in terms of feasibility, I would say Germany is on a path where they can do more in areas where there has been modest development towards transatlantic convergence to begin with. Unfortunately, the Trump presidency and the public conflict there has sort of overshadowed it. But I have worked in depth on German policy towards Russia after the Ukraine crisis, and I keep being surprised by how resolute the German response was and how effectively Germany used its central position within the European Union to maintain a united front, if you will, towards Russia. This is something that the German political system can apparently do, and especially can do if it's supported by a US administration that enables it to do so, and that is willing and able to compensate for certain weaknesses in the status quo. So enable not necessarily German leadership, because that has a sour taste for many Europeans and for many Germans, I might add. But rather to allow major European countries to form an encompassing coalition. And that requires a lot of multilateralism. However, multilateralism and procedural thinking is sort of a German expertise. So if you are willing to have incremental and slow change, this is something where Germany can double down. If the conversation is right, and if it doesn't get politicized. The Social Democrats in part ran against an image of the United States as being hegemonic and frivolous, and personalized that in part with the Trump administration. If you get different signals from the US, as I would argue happened under Obama, this can work quite well. There is a modest development in German policy towards more defense spending, a realization that you have to not just put your money where your mouth is, but also commit your troops to where your mouth is. That has been happening in NATO Operation Enhanced Forward Presence. There might well, there I see room for more, without a doubt. And lastly, in terms of Ukraine, I don't expect a miraculous deal to be struck anytime soon, but I believe in better or worse options. And there again, Germany is still keeping up a negotiation process. It's not considered as favorable by Russia anymore. Russian experts speak of German normalization, by which they mean a normalization as a Western country. And there are connotations of aggressiveness, of liberal arrogance, of hegemonic behavior and so forth. Nonetheless, the channels work relatively well. And the new generation of politicians coming up in at least the mainstream parties seem to have a more, dare I say, transatlantic spirit than maybe the one preceding it. So in all of these areas, if you expect modest steps, you might well have your expectations met. If you over-demand, you might get the opposite, is how I see German politics going forward.
Thank you. Let me address China. And as you point out, we're moving toward a much more robust policy in terms of the Asian Pacific and particularly China. It's expected that, of course, Biden will also pursue that, although questionable exactly which direction he'll take it. But how would this this impact Russia? I mean, how will Russia see our taking as well? You know, the EU has turned to a larger China policy. NATO last December, just about this time, also came out with comments that were in terms of NATO's policy toward China for really the first time. What do you see being Russia's reaction to that? And how does it even fit in with this trilateral Russia, US, and Germany?
Yes. So maybe let's first talk about Russia and China. That is a fascinating relationship, and when you see Russian security analysts talk amongst themselves, you see two big themes. The one is that there is a sort of unity in spirit and effort, where a lot of rhetoric is revolving around China and Russia sharing an interest of state sovereignty, as they like to say, which depending on where you stand politically, you can read as attempts to protect their respective autocratic regime against overt Western liberal and democratic policy, or against the democratizing side effects of liberal globalization. And there is a big theme of cooperation going on, and in part you see efforts to materialize that into actual policy. Now that's the one narrative. The other one is, which ties in nicely with a Russian elite discourse that is quite realist in its outlooks, is power focused, and looks at power trends. And there, if you look at Russian demography and the prospects of its economic growth, things are looking quite dire. China, despite its many problems, is still a very dynamic economy, is a huge country, and has already a formidable military arsenal. And if you want to look very far into the future, there is still territory that is currently in legally Russian, but where China might well have historical claims towards. You have diasporas that cross these borders, or at least have cross-border interconnections. And my research in other areas shows and further corroborates that this can well be a source of tension if it becomes politicized. And there are all sorts of scenarios in which this can be politicized, and this is taken seriously within Moscow. So Russian regime interests vaguely align with that of China, but all sorts of other factors would put it into the Russian interest to cooperate more with other countries in order to have a, as they nicely say, a constructive and mutually respectful relationship with China. Now that brings me to how this ties into transatlantic relations. And there, I would caution against too much optimism that Europe will become very active in a security and defense area towards China. I think a lot can be done where the economic interests of the US and the EU converge toward a common China policy, because the US and the EU are, in terms of their economic profile, relatively similar. Sometimes they are competitors, but they also have a shared interest in the protection of intellectual property to retain their edge in certain services and production circles, and so forth. So I think a lot can be done there. I'm sure Max, my fellow here at AICGS, can tell much more about this. I would be much more humble in my expectation when it comes to security cooperation, because the Europeans have shown that even in conflicts in their immediate environment, it very much depends on operative threat perceptions. If you consider the strength of the German response towards Russia after the annexation of Crimea, that was a strong reaction and a good example of, I think, a transatlantic cooperation. However, the annexation of Crimea entailed threat perceptions towards Germany proper and towards immediate neighbors of Germany. If you look at, for example, the Syria intervention, Germany abstained even from a UN resolution to enable the intervention that was ultimately conducted by the UK, France, and the United States. So even there, it's contingent with a major player like Germany. So if you then apply this to a country in potential conflicts that is much more far away, that is much more militarily capable, where much higher economic stakes are at play, and you have all sorts of policy complications, I wouldn't hold my breath for NATO shifting its main focus into Southeast Asia. And I think acknowledging that will help to realize what is actually possible in terms of EU and NATO cooperation towards China. I would just like, as a last point, maybe to point out, depending on how Russian domestic politics develop, and there, of course, are big question marks, Russia desperately needs to modernize its economy. And the main partner there is not China, it's actually the EU, because it's so close, because it has the capital and the know-how to do so. And this is something that even the Putin administration repeatedly stresses, and they are right in doing so, but there are all sorts of impediments towards it. So there is a structural constellation, an economic need to cooperate with Europe, and a strategic need to be well positioned towards China that in the long future might actually enable a taming of Russian-Western relations and more cooperation there.
That's an interesting way for us to finish off. And I'd like to thank you so much for your participation, and particularly for the work that you've done with us, with AICGS, in the fellowship program. And I think that it's contributed a great deal, and we will be publishing Jonas's paper in the either next week or at the beginning of the year. And we look very much forward to it, and hope that our audience will also take a look at it in the AICGS Advisor. So thank you, Jonas.
Thank you very much, Gail.
And I think we're right exactly at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. All the best to you in your future work, and congratulations on that PhD.
Thank you very much.